Here in the United States, it is often pretended that the distribution of wealth we have is only a little off of what is normal or typical in capitalist societies. Well, I looked into this, and I thought you might be interested, as I was, to compare the United States to 4 other countries that are in many ways like us, and to ask the question, is wealth distributed more or less in those countries the way it is here? And if not, why not, and what are the consequences? So let's start with Finland. The richest 1% of people in Finland own 12.5% of the wealth, which means poorer people have smaller shares of the wealth in Finland. But Finland is an egalitarian society when we begin to look elsewhere. The second country I looked at, Canada, 15.5%. France, 1%, owns 18% of the wealth. Germany, in some ways the most like us in Europe. In Germany, the richest 1% own 24.5% of the wealth. That's right. The top 1% own 1/4 of the wealth. That's a very unequal society. Significantly more unequal than France, even more unequal relative to Canada, and extremely unequal relative to Finland. So now let's come to the United States. How much of the national wealth of the United States is owned by the top 1%? 41.8%. That's right. The richest 1% own 41.8% of the wealth. Now, Finland, Canada, France, and Germany are all capitalist economies. They are economies in which the overwhelming bulk of goods and services are produced by private enterprises and distributed in markets. They are capitalist economies, but they do not permit anything like the level of inequality that we accept in the United States. We are the most unequally distributed society in terms of wealth of any of the advanced countries. We are an extreme outlier. How did it happen? We have been, as a nation, extraordinarily vicious and violent in turning against the institutions that might have prevented this level of inequality. And that's clear from my research, because when you look at Finland, Canada, France, and Germany, they all have stronger versions of these institutions than we do. Well, what are those institutions? Trade unions, stronger in terms of their social position, often also in terms of their membership. The social position of trade unions is stronger in all those countries than it is in the United States. Trade unions that advocate for their members, that push for higher incomes, that push for laws and rules and regulations that limit what corporations can do, all of those are stronger in those other countries than they are in ours. In every one of those countries, there are left-wing political parties that have considerable popular appeal and considerable electoral success. Some more, some less, and it varies at the times. But socialist parties, anti-capitalist parties, parties closely linked to trade unions and expressing their perspectives in a systematic way, all of that is more present in Finland, Canada, France, and Germany than it is in the United States. Which means that both the trade union and the political party that speaks for labor and constrains capital is what's missing here in the United States. And is it missing because we haven't experimented with it? Not at all. Trade unions were once much stronger in the United States than they are today. In 1950s, 1/3 of America's private sector workers were represented by a union. Today, it's less than 7%. And likewise, we once had strong socialist parties, strong labor-based wings of the Democratic Party. We don't have either of those. socialist, communist, and other anti-capitalist parties are tiny shadows today of what they once were. And the labor or progressive wing of the Democratic Party has been in decline for decades, although that may be turning around if the Bernie Sanders effort is any sign. These institutions have been repressed by the private sector and by the government. We've had Joe McCarthyism, we have had anti-leftism everywhere in our society, sustained by all kinds of politicians, by all kinds of private, well-funded groups. We've had a fairly vicious repression of the left for most of the last half century, so there's no surprise. But that inequality has consequences. When you have an inequality as extreme as that here in the United States, other things are extreme too. If 1% of the people together have 41.8% of the wealth, and that's what we have in America, then those 1% have to be, let me underscore that, have to be very worried that the mass of people looking at this inequality will take steps to use their vote, one person, one vote, to undo that inequality, to redistribute that wealth, or maybe even reorganize the economy so it never gets distributed like that in the first place, and therefore we wouldn't need redistribution. To protect against that, the 1%, if they have that much wealth, can devote a sizable chunk of it to keeping the rest of it. That's why politics is corrupted in societies with this kind of inequality. It's corrupted because the rich understand, especially here in the United States, where they are so extremely rich, and where, because of their extreme wealth, they can devote huge amounts of money to buying the parties, to buying the candidates, to pumping the airwaves full of messages to keep their wealth off the radar, to make people unaware of it, to make people concerned about other issues, to keep everything going in such a way as not to question or challenge or change the inequality that makes all this happen. If you are not satisfied with the economic conditions of the United States, please be aware that a capitalist system that gives so much of the wealth to so small a part of the population is a central cause of your economic distress. And that being angry at immigrants or being angry at government regulations is a mistake in terms of understanding where the basic problems lie. We have a system that generates a level of inequality that corrodes the institutions we depend on.